this current phase of the conflict in Ukraine is coming to an end. And that is, something that I've described a few times before. The Russians have essentially broken through all of that fortified belt, let's call it, that the Ukrainians built up over the course of 8 years or maybe even longer, starting in 2014. It's a series of fortifications and fortified, trenches and fortified cities that it really through the 2024, the Russians broke through it, starting at Avdiivka. That was that's where they breached the main fortified lines. You could say that Avdiivka was the true fortress city, and they took it. And then after that, they've been punching through these other lines, and they're coming to the end. It's a whole belt. It's, and it's not one line. It's maybe 30 miles deep. But just recently, they took Karakovo, which was one of these fortified cities and also a hub, very important. They have taken Toretsk. That's another one of them. And quite a large city, I think, if you include all the suburbs, it comes close to, not a, particularly large city, but a substantial city, close to 100,000 people, if you look at the greater, Toretsk area. And then Chasiv Yar, that's that city that's up on a hill, really, behind Bakhmut. And that's been a very tough battle. But the Russians are at the end of that. They have something like 90% of the city, and it looks like the remaining Ukrainians are losing their grip and starting to retreat. So Chasiv Yar, that's another one of them. And then in the south, there's this place called Velisa Novosilka, I believe it is. And it's not very big. I think we're talking maybe less than 10,000. It's a fairly small town, but it was also highly fortified. And the thing is, after that, there's really nothing. There are no more of these fortified cities. We know that the Russians are now laying siege to Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk is a very important city, but as a hub, as a logistical hub. And to my knowledge, it's not built up. It's not really well fortified. When in 2024, the Ukrainians realized that the Russians were coming from Pokrovsk, they did send in a lot of soldiers, and apparently that's one place that they've tried to reinforce their lines. And they've done some sort of digging, some sort of effort to build fortifications there. But my understanding is that they're not very significant. So I don't think Pokrovsk, though it's quite large, really won't last very long. It's not an Avdiivka, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, anything like this. So anyway, we're looking in 2025. I think we're going to see a different kind of war. 2024 was the march through the fortifications. 2025 will be a march across the steppe to the Dnieper. And I think that has to be very different, and it has to be quite a bit faster than what we saw in 2024. We may not see that happen right away. Again, the Russians are dealing with a lot of mud. There's been an unusually warm January in eastern Ukraine. But if that ground firms up, and it eventually will, I think we'll see some relatively rapid progress on the part of the Russians.
Have the Russians updated their goals at all? Do we know what their intentions are? Because we were talking about just these 4 eastern oblasts that will become Russian controlled. I guess the big question now is, will they go further, and how much further, and what are they going to do? Because one of the goals that Putin stated, and I think we can dive into this a little bit, is to denazify Ukraine. Yeah. Which I think is a very interesting goal that, of course, the West never talks about, because to the Western world, except who?
Except Timok,
okay.
Yeah.
I thought you said some guy's name, but because Nazism for the Western world, that is the epitome of evil. That's
or
the benchmark
anyway. Yeah.
Right. So that's how we view it. And then Putin comes with this goal to denazify Ukraine. And I know a little bit about the history of the Banda rights, and that there is this far right, I don't know if it's fair to say Nazi element But maybe you can talk a little bit about that. Is that still a goal, and how real is that goal to say
Yeah.
denazify Ukraine? It's such a, it's a mind blowing concept to think that we're supporting a
Yeah,
regime
right.
that the Russians view as a Nazi regime.
Right. Well, okay. Again, that's the term that the Russians use, and I don't think it's really incorrect to use that term, to describe them as neo-Nazis. I prefer to use the term Banderites because though, clearly there is this historical link, a very tight historical link with the Nazis and the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Bandera did work very closely, uh, with the Nazis, with the SS in particular. And there were SS regiments that I think were made up of largely Ukrainians. He was above all a Ukrainian nationalist. Now he was a Ukrainian nationalist that kind of modeled himself on the Nazis in Germany in many ways. So there is this very, very close connection. And there's just no question that he and his followers were responsible for many massacres. I think we're talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths. I don't know what the exact figure, but I think the polls, for example, point to a particular massacre that numbered approximately 100,000. And they've been trying to get the Banderites, in other words, the Ukrainian government, to acknowledge this. And recently they've had some success. And, in general, there's been a great deal of resistance, but the Ukrainian government, I think, is allowing Poland to for example, maybe exhume the graves of the murdered Polish victims. But at the same time, the Ukrainian government continues to honor, more than honor, but, almost, almost to worship, Bandera and his associates. So you have statues to him. There are constant references to him. He is the hero of Ukraine, and yet, like when the Russians look at him, and the Poles too. This is, they see this mass murderer. Now it would be one thing if this was just World War II history, and for whatever reason, the Ukrainians wanted to maintain this connection. But the thing is that it's clear that his ideology lives on in this extreme Ukrainian ultranationalism, hatred of Russians, and open suppression of Russian culture, suppression of the Russian language, suppression of the Orthodox Church that's connected to Russian Orthodoxy. All of these things are being suppressed, and often violently so. So there is a Banderite ideology that is in charge. It used to be somewhat on the fringes. It was always there. It was always a force, going back 20, 30 years even, from the time that Ukraine gained its independence. But it has grown much stronger, really, ever since, particularly since the 2014 coup that took place in Kiev, the Maidan Square coup, and that was really done with Banderite muscle, we could say, had Banderite guns, and they still a lot of people. I think one thing before I go forward is important to point out now. This notion that there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine is mocked. Whenever it's brought up by the Russians, but prior to 2022. It did, occasionally an awareness of that seeped into the Western consciousness, and there were articles that appeared in major publications like the New York Times. I think there was one that I think it was the New York Times that said, yes, Ukraine does have a Nazi problem.
Mm-hmm. I think I remember that.
Yeah. And then the U.S. Congress, in fact, passed a bill prohibiting any sort of financial support for the Azov Brigade, which again is a Banderite, or you could say a neo-Nazi brigade in Ukraine. But since then, now it's become absolutely forbidden to bring this up anymore in the West. It was something that was discussed, that was acknowledged, kind of, not at the center of it wasn't part of the mainstream narrative, but it was there, and anybody who, was paying attention knew about it. so yeah, they're there. They have grown in power. They've come to really dominate the country. Like of course I think the real breakthrough for them was Maidan, because they were the muscle that made that happen. And then later, when Zelensky came to power, he did not come to power as a Banderite. In fact, you could call him sort of an anti-Banderite. He wanted peace with the Russians. He wanted to actually implement the Minsk Accords, which would have been wonderful for Ukraine, right? They wouldn't have lost. We never had this war. They wouldn't have lost any territories. But when he attempted to do it, he was essentially threatened with death by the Banderites, and after that, he shut up. There's a video out there that actually shows him trying to attempt to give a speech and propose implementation of the Minsk Accords. So he's somewhere close to the battle lines in eastern Ukraine, but he gets shouted down by the Banderites then there, and that was really the end of it. They let him know in no uncertain terms that there was not going to be any peace with the Russians. There's only going to be war. And now, you hear him talk, you wouldn't know that he was ever a peace candidate. I think in the end, it's hard to know to what extent this is conscious but he has become a Banderite himself. I mean, it's become, they have taken over the government. They are the ruling ideology in Ukraine. Now so this question, can we denazify? I think the only way that you could do that is to actually march all the way to the Polish border, to subjugate all of Ukraine and impose, some sort of martial law on Ukraine for decades, years or maybe even decades. It would to really remove it, root and branch would be, I think, well nigh impossible. You think about it, because it survived the Soviet decades. Right. There was, one thing I didn't mention was that actually during the first years, or, even like decade after the fall of Nazi Germany, the West began trying to foment rebellion within Ukraine by using these followers of Bandera. And they even, parachuted in agents, MI6 or CIA, to establish contacts with them, provide them with arms. And so they never really got anywhere, mostly got themselves killed, but they were a thorn in the side of the Soviets for years afterwards with the help from the West. And then, you stopped hearing about them, but it's clear that they were always there, because when the Soviet Union fell and Ukraine gained its independence, I believe in 1991, they came out, they reappeared, and they began, erecting statues to Stefan Bandera and forming their organizations. And here they are, they rule. So how are you going to get rid of them? That's the one part of Putin's program that I've always had doubts about. I'd like to believe it. I think it would be very good for Ukraine, and good for the world if these people were eliminated. But how are you going to do that? I just don't know.
Right. I was going to bring that up because I was thinking, like, if you're fighting an ideology, it's basically impossible. It's hard because this is what we're seeing in the Middle East. Like, how do you stop Israel, Zionism, or if you're on the Israeli side, they're looking at Hamas and the Palestinians. It's like this goes beyond just kind of a small territorial dispute. If you can't wipe out an ideology, or it's very hard, right? This is something that usually takes generational change. Like you said, they survived the Soviet years, and from what it sounds like, the West has been kind of using Ukraine to attack the Soviet Union, Russia for 70 years. You can
argue that,
yeah. So, what does that mean then? Do you think that is still a goal, that they might try to do this full-on occupation, or do you just think it's an impossible goal?
Okay. Mark Sloboda argues that they don't want to do. They don't want to march all the way to the Polish border because they know that the people in Western Ukraine genuinely do hate the Russians. That's kind of part of being a Western Ukrainian, and a Banderite. That's that you just can't separate the two. It's unfortunate. It's something very different in Eastern Ukraine. I think as we can see, they've been welcome, and all these cities that they have liberated recently, there are always people coming out of basements and hugging the soldiers. And then in the territories that they control, they're really, I think it's quite clear that support for the Russian government is quite strong. You're not seeing protests in the recent elections. Donetsk had one of the highest pro-Putin voting results anywhere in the country. But it's something else entirely in Western Ukraine. They would have to deal with an insurgency. It could be a really bloody, messy affair. He thinks, Mark Sloboda argues that, they don't want to do it, but they just might have to. They just might find that they just have to, because that these Banderites will just never stop fighting and lobbing missiles and, at civilian targets within Russian held territory. And the West will never stop supporting them, and that they'll just have to go all the way. I think, but he may prove to be right, but I think they just don't want to go. Putin doesn't want to go down that road, and he'll take a kind of a messy, incomplete denazification. In other words, he'll drive it out of at least half of the country. Again, I think definitely they will end up taking the clearly Russian-leaning parts of the country in the east and the south. I think there's a good chance they might go further and take the central part of the country, which is, not really so much pro-Russian, but it doesn't have a history of anti-Russian hatred the way that you find out in the West. So they could go to Kiev. But I think they will stay out of the West, and they'll just accept that they can't, that their denazification is incomplete.
Do you think Russia would be welcome in Kiev?
At the present time, I would say no. It just may be, but initially there was a tremendous amount of support for the government. I think that happens when a war first breaks out. But over time, that support has been softening. It certainly has, it's been plummeting in the case of Zelensky, but I think overall it's been softening, when they've started to realize that this is, what they're facing. And as they've been subjected to, increasingly brutal oppression by their government, especially Russian speakers in places like Kiev, you have, most people are Russian speakers. Zelensky is a Russian speaker. He's recently he had that long interview with
Lex Friedman.
Lex Friedman, exactly, and he insisted on doing it in Ukrainian when, in fact, both of them are Russian speakers. But he had to switch over to Russian again and again because his Ukrainian is so bad. And interestingly, he, like all his comedies and movies that he did early in his pre-political career as a comedian and actor, were done in Russian. But now they have to, according to laws that he himself has supported, they have to be dubbed in Ukrainian. So he can't actually hear Zelensky's voice anymore. Yeah, so like the most Ukrainians speak Russian. For them, it's the first language, and not all of them identify as Russians. That's where you find that in the east and the south, but they don't necessarily. I think it's possible that this very these very oppressive policies that the current government, I think it's fair to say, regime has been pursuing in Ukraine. May be turning a lot of the people against the regime, and they may, in the end, just be relieved when the Russians come. Again, we see the press gangs. That I don't think that's happened so much. Like Kiev has been more or less spared that, but many, many other places in central and even in Western Ukraine have not been spared that, and that is not going to make for a popular government.
Right. And Zelensky also signed into law that no negotiations with Putin, right? So Do you just mean that just Russia is just going to continue moving forward until
there are not going to be any negotiations, or if they begin, they won't go anywhere.
So, and you're talking about not with the U.S. as well. I mean, Trump's got that meeting. It's just you think it doesn't matter.
And I think that's good. But I think for all the reasons that I've given, both on the U.S. side and the Russian side, and then, not to mention the Ukrainians, it just can't happen. Any deal that the Russians would accept won't be acceptable by the Western establishment, including the American establishment. They will, they'll pull out all stops to try to, to destroy it, and I think they'll succeed. And I think Trump realizes that he can't go down that path. To actually make a deal with the Russians, he would have to concede so much. It's just, at this point, again, it would be an admission of defeat, as I've said earlier, and that's something that no U.S. president can do.
Yeah, well, what's another admission of defeat is when the Russian army just rolls through Kiev, right. which is what's going to happen, right?
Yeah, well, maybe.
If they don't,
I don't know if they'll go to Kiev, but they may.
Yeah. I mean, basically, I see there's a couple options. The West continues supporting Ukraine, pumping in as much money as they can, but the problem is that Ukraine is simply running out of people. They don't, and that's the horrific part of it. They're just running out of people, and I hear there's a huge reluctance to lower the recruiting. So right, even the military saying they're also saying these people don't want to fight. They're worthless if you give them to us anyway. Yeah. So they're just going to be thrown in the meat grinder. Maybe buy you a little bit of time, but there's nothing there. So you're coming up to this hard physical constraint that is human lives, and they're running out of it. So you can pump in money for a little bit, maybe prop it up a bit longer, or the Ukrainian regime will be overthrown from within. That there's going to be some type of revolt, or there's the possibility that there's somehow, this is how I would do it if I was Trump. I think I would embrace the whole democracy thing. Mm-hmm. Get elections going again in Kiev, force, because Zelensky's term has ended 8 months ago or longer now. I don't remember. So have a referendum, let them decide, and then obviously there'll be some time, but of course with the constraint that there's going to be no NATO, there'll be neutrality. But then let a new government come into place, right? Why can't that happen? And shouldn't the West love to get behind that? I mean, there's nothing democratic about the current Ukrainian government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
let's go democracy, right? Let's do this. Let's vote.
Well, clearly they're not interested in actual democracy. It's just a word, right? It's just democracy just means it's the government that we approve of, that works with us, that does our bidding. That's democracy.
But the Nazi government, that's the one we approve.
Yeah, that's democracy. Yeah, exactly. That with the press gangs and the suppression of Russian speech and culture and the church and. Yeah, that's democracy, don't you know?
Yeah, but couldn't Trump frame it that way? Let's go back to our democratic Western values.
There actually have been some moves and talk that there might be an election, but the idea is you have an election in which the main opposition candidate, the one that is likely that the polls show would win, is not allowed to participate. So it would be another kind of rigged election, like
another Romania. Western democracy move.
A Western democracy, right? Like in Romania or something. The polls all show that the candidate that would defeat him is actually General Zaluzhny. Now, General Zaluzhny is a Banderite. There's no question about it. I think he has not one but two busts of Stefan Bandera in his office, and you can see them in interviews that he gave earlier. But he is a better general, better than Syrskyi. He's not a purely political animal. He does, understand the military realities. And so I know that when he was still the head of the armed forces in Ukraine, he often did advocate for retreats. He was just more realistic. He said, we need to go back and build up our defenses here because we can't hold this point. We can't hold Bakhmut. We can't hold Andreevka. And of course, he was proven correct. Syrskyi is a purely political animal and just does whatever Zelensky tells him to do, no matter how stupid it is. I guess Zaluzhny would give him pushback. So anyway, if you ended up with Zaluzhny, I'm afraid that there wouldn't be any change in domestic policy I mean, he is a Banderite, but you would probably find a more intelligent strategy pursued by the armed forces, which could not bring about victory, but it would make, would slow the Russian advances, make it more difficult for the Russians to achieve their territorial objectives.
Well, so you were saying that there was a candidate that they were not allowing to run at all. That sounds Zelensky, right?
So, no, that's Zelensky.
That is Zelensky.
Yeah, those are the rumors
Oh.
anyway. There have been reports to that effect. Yeah, because Zelensky is the guy who would win, and they don't want him. At least Zelensky doesn't want him to win. I should maybe Zelensky thinks that he can win the election if they get Zelensky. We'll hold an election, but we'll just make sure the most popular candidate, the guy who can beat me, is not allowed to participate.
Right, but is there a non-Banderite candidate out there?
Well,
I mean,
unfortunately, I don't think so. That's the thing. It's just that the Banderites have really taken over.
Right, but
as people opposed to Arestovich, was it Arestovich? I have
no idea.
With names, but he was the former spokesman for Zelensky, but then he, maybe it was several months or a year into the war, he stepped down. And I don't think he's in Ukraine, but he has been highly, highly critical of the Ukrainian regime ever since. And he's basically said, look, the Russians are going to win. It actually just makes a lot more sense for us to make a deal with the Russians. In the end, our future is with Russia. And who knows how many people really might in fact support it. It's hard to tell because, again, in spite of everything that the Western press tells us, Ukraine is not anything like a democracy, and people live in fear. They live in fear of being grabbed off the streets. They lived in fear of, being accused of, treason for saying the wrong thing. So they're going to be very reluctant to report their honest opinions in when polled.
Well, yeah, I mean, maybe Trump could work something out with the Russians where there's sort of a third party, group that helps to secure and keep things safe for the election process to ensure that things are done without fear of, a non-Banderite candidate getting, people bullying them for not voting them, or even just outright killing a candidate that would be pro peace, essentially, not necessarily pro-Russia, but just pro-neutrality, pro-end of the bloodshed. You think that's possible? That could be something that they put together?
I don't know. It seems like right now, the West doesn't show any interest in that. They seem to be happy with Zelensky.
Is there any recognition from the West that Stepan Bandera was a bad guy? Do we is that a consensus that we say that, or we even try to change that?
I think
history?
it is. Like if you go to Wikipedia or something, you'll see that. Wikipedia can be highly censored and highly distorted, but I don't think that's been changed about it. His historical assessment of him is that he was basically a Nazi and was responsible for horrible atrocities. I don't think anybody's denying that, but they just deny the connection between him and present day Ukraine. There's just no talk about that.
Right. Well, Zelensky, he was the general of the Ukraine Armed Forces, and now he's ambassador of Ukraine to the UK, and he's also, you're saying, the most popular potential candidate for the president. And you say he has two busts of Stepan Bandera. Two of them. I mean, he's doubly Bandera and double Banderite.
Right.
So I just said, how does the West grapple with that? How do we?
They just don't grapple with it. They just simply ignore it. That's what they've been doing for a long time. They just suppress that news. They don't discuss it. If somebody brings it up, it's a Putin talking point, and they start shouting, telling that person to shut up. That's it. There's nothing more sophisticated than that. Nobody's grappling with it. They just don't.
I hate how effective. Out of mind.
It's very effective.
That method is. Right. Yeah. Putin talking point and just shut up, and then you're immediately on the defensive. Like, no, let me tell you the history of this. Nobody wants to hear it.
Right. Yeah. Even when you pointed out, hey, this is what our own people were saying just a few years ago.
The New York Times.
Right, exactly. That was not a Putin talking point.